All right. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our members, followers, and friends around the world. I am Joan Kang Shin, and I'm the online events coordinator for the IATEFL YLTSIG. So, following the great success of the YLTSIG's inaugural web conference in February, we're delighted to be relaunching our monthly webinar series. Starting today, we have a webinar brought to you in collaboration with the IATEFL MOS-SIG, Materials Writing SIG, and on behalf of the YLTSIG coordinator, David Valent, and the MOS-SIG coordinator, Rachel Roberts, and both of our SIGs committees, we'd like to warmly welcome you to Katherine Bilsborough's inspiring webinar, Writing Good Quality Primary Materials, Tips, Tools, and Common Sense. And we will be recording this webinar so that you may be able to view it later if you're a member of the YLT and the MOS-SIGs. So let me introduce Kat to you. Katherine is a freelance ELT author, content developer, and teacher trainer. She has written course books for many of the major ELT publishers, as well as online courses and mobile learning materials for the BBC and the British Council. She writes monthly lesson plans for the Teaching English website and is the author of How to Write Primary Materials, published by ELT Teacher to Writer. So, without further ado, over to you, Katherine.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you to the IATEFL, YTL-SIG and MORE-SIG for the opportunity. It's great being able to do a webinar because we're able that way to reach people who we might not normally reach. And I think that webinars are just a fantastic thing to do for professional development. So I hope that we all get something to take away today from this webinar. And I include myself in that too, because even though I'm the person giving this webinar, I'm sure that I learned something new today as well. I always do. So I'm talking about writing good quality primary materials. And this is for anybody who writes materials for their classrooms. Maybe some of you want to start developing materials in a more professional way. But basically, I firmly believe that all teachers are materials writers because at some time or other we will be creating something to take into class, whether it be a worksheet or some supplementary materials. Maybe we want to replace something in the textbook or support something in the textbook. And what happens very often is that we create materials for the classrooms and we give some thought to what we're going to do and what we want to practice, if you like, but we aren't always as rigorous as we might be with our materials. So this webinar really is looking at how we can make our materials top quality. Okay, and I'm hoping to show you some tips and some tools and common sense. At the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to common sense. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time hopefully for some questions. So if you have a question as we're going through, you can either write it in the chat box and Joan will try to collect those questions, or you can make a note of it and write it at the end, and we'll hopefully have time to answer them. So let's have a look then at where we're coming from. What we're going to do, we're going to have an introduction about materials, just briefly, and then we're going to go straight into what I hope will be some practical information. So we're going to look at what the most common mistakes we make when we make materials for our classes are. And we're going to look at how we can move from a problem to a solution. And then I'm going to finish with offering a simple framework to ensure that we can make sure our materials reach that quality, good quality mark. And again, at the very end, some questions and answers. So when you think about it, how can we ensure quality standards when we create our own classroom materials? Okay, this picture here represents me. That's a picture of me in two modes, if you like. So the first picture on the left is me when I'm writing materials for a publisher, and the picture on the right is me when I'm writing materials for my classes and I have no publisher to support me. So all of these jobs and roles that a publisher does, I have to either take on myself or maybe reject or neglect and just don't address. So with the publisher, we have somebody who's an editor, we have a designer, we'll have a reviewer, we'll have somebody checking every stage of the materials. But when we write materials ourselves for our own classes, usually we're entirely on our own. Okay, so what happens is obviously we aren't able to always reach as high a standard as a publisher might or as published materials might. So everybody makes mistakes. Can you see the mistake in that slide? And I was interested in looking at what the most common mistakes are that people make when they publish their own materials. And I did a survey recently, not very scientific. I didn't really think it through a great deal, but I did a survey and I shared it on social media. And I asked teachers and colleagues and people in the profession to identify what they considered to be the most annoying mistakes that they came across in classroom materials that had been published by teachers or made by teachers, if you like. This was looking at materials that were shared on the internet, okay? Obviously, we don't share all of our materials on the internet, but it was quite interesting to see what those common errors were and how many of them people felt particularly annoyed by. And these are the results of the survey, okay? Or this is one of the results from the survey. So 400 people, more than 400 people actually answered the questions, but these are the most common errors that we make when we make classroom materials as well, okay? Errors in spelling, confusing instructions, inappropriate content, intrusive advertising. Obviously, this only comes into play when we are creating things and sharing them on the internet. Overcrowded pages, okay. Errors in an answer key. Obviously, if this is when you are using materials that somebody else has created, but sometimes we make mistakes in answer keys that we ourselves are going to use. And then errors in level. And the last one here on the list is the one that most people found annoying. And almost 60% of people said they found this was the most annoying thing, which was messy or confusing layout. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at each of these problems and maybe a couple of more. And we're going to think about very simple ways that we can avoid making mistakes in these areas. Okay? So the first one is typos and spelling mistakes. And I'm just going to ask you to contribute here and to join in. And everybody has a word, or at least one word, that they always misspell when they're writing really quickly. And I know what mine are, and I'll tell you what they are in a minute. But can I ask you to write in the chat box which words you always misspell? Because you will have words that you spell wrong again and again. Okay, and you're writing there. Joanna, you've written there. That's one of my pet ones as well. And another one of my pet ones is students. And I write it like this when I'm writing very quickly. Our Rachel's written exactly the same. So it's more of a typo. Okay, so it's typos and spelling mistakes we're talking about here. So what can we do to avoid those? Because sometimes we pick them up afterwards, but sometimes we don't. And then they are in our materials, we've printed them off, we've shared them out, and it's not good, is it? So there are a couple of things we can do. And one of the things we can do, and I got this idea, well, not an idea, it's a hack, if you like, from Karen. My brain has gone dead. Karen White, who's an editor, and she told me that we can customize the spell check on our computers. Okay, so if we're working in Word, we can actually add the common words that we always misspell or with typos by following these steps. And if we do this, I'm going to show you a screenshot in a moment of how it looks. I've got here the steps you have to follow, but this is what it looks like on the actual computer. If you actually add, here we've added studnets and studnets for students. So that means that if I do this and then I click OK, that means that every time when I'm writing in words and I make that particular typo, the computer program will automatically correct it as I'm writing. So I never need to worry anymore about that particular mistake. When Karen told me about this, I couldn't believe it because it saves me so much time and worry, because you do forget, you do miss things. And even if you go back and replace words, sometimes things get through the net. So that's the first tip, if you like. Okay, so you can actually add words that you always spell wrong to your autocorrect in Word. So that's one thing you can do. And the other thing, obviously, is that 4 eyes are better than 2. So it's always a good idea, to get somebody else to look at your materials, okay? Now, this doesn't have to be a teacher. It can be a colleague, but it can be anybody who can read, okay, in English. But it can be somebody who's a friend, it can be a student, it can be a colleague, it can be a neighbour. And it's always a good idea to just say, can you have a quick look at this? And I think that as teachers and professionals, we should try to collaborate more, and maybe online in groups on Facebook, social media, whatever. We can set up groups of like-minded people, and if 3 or 4 of us are creating materials for our classes, we can say, please, can you have a quick read of this for me, or what do you think about this, and help each other. And I'm just going to show you quickly. I think I've got 8 sentences, and I want you to just look very, very quickly at them and write in the chat box which sentence or sentences have a mistake. Okay, so just do that quickly. So have a quick look, and any mistakes you see, just write the number quickly in the chat box. Okay, so I can see numbers here. Number 2, number 1, number 3, 1 and 2. Rachel's very clever and she's a very quick reader, and she probably knows what I've done here. But exactly what I've done here is I've put a mistake in every single sentence there, okay? So the 8 sentences, and they all have a mistake. I'm not going to go through them all, okay? Well, maybe 1 or 2. So the first ones you've picked up, so your and your with the apostrophe, that's a clear one. We've got pronunciation misspelt in number 3. We've got friend misspelled in number 5. Okay, and this is the kind of thing, these are the kind of mistakes that we easily miss. And what I wanted to show you there, the reason I asked you to write the number in the chat box is because we all notice different things. Okay? So a mistake that will pass you by, somebody else will pick up on, and vice versa. And that's why it's always good to ask somebody else to look at anything, any materials that you're going to take into class. Okay, well done for spotting the mistakes, especially those of you who haven't had enough coffee yet. It's early in the morning. So, another common area where we get things wrong in our materials is the level. It's not easy, it isn't easy to create materials that are the right level for our classes. Well, for a start, very often within a class we might have several levels, and that will make things even more complicated, obviously. But even when we have a class and we are told, okay, this is a B1 class or this is a pre-intermediate class, how do we know which language we have to teach at this level? So we're talking about primary today, okay? This can be true for other age groups as well, but particularly for primary. When I am creating things for primary, how do I know which language to teach for a start? Level wise. Okay. Well, we need to get help from the experts. And who are the experts? Well, people who know all about the levels. And the best people, I think, for this kind of thing are exams preparers, if you like. So, one of the places where I go to know about which vocabulary I should be teaching at different levels is, for example, here is the Cambridge exams. um, this is from, if you go to the internet and you Google Cambridge exams, young learners exams, and they've got a free handbook, a PDF handbook that you can download, and it has word lists in alphabetical order, and it tells you basically which words your students should know at different levels. Okay, so this is S means starter level. Okay, so this is the lowest level, and they consider this to be, this is the example of all the words in S that they would expect your learners to know at this level. Okay, again, it isn't rocket science, but it's a good for first port of call, if you like. Sometimes the language is obvious. Sometimes you might be surprised, and they've got these handbooks for all of the levels for the young learner exams. So somebody's asking what's the website. So if you Google Cambridge YL exams handbook, I'm just writing that in the chat, um, you'll find it. It comes up as a PDF and there's lots of information in there. Also in there, this is from the same place, the same handbook. It's not very clear, I'm sorry, it's a bit small, but it gives you also the grammar and the structures that the children in this case will be expected to know at this age, at this level. So it will tell you what kind of, which verb forms, etc., present simple, or whether, so later on when they're doing first certificate, it would be the passive, etc., etc. And it gives you a good idea of what language you should be including in your materials for each level. Thank you, Alex, for adding that. That's brilliant. I've this page here that I've added is from the Trinity Young Learner Exams page website. Okay, and it's it's similar. It's just laid out in a different way. And they say what the language requirements are for the different levels too. And they state what those levels will be and suggest the age groups too. So it tells you here, for example, for the grammar, they should know present simple tense questions, etc., etc. So you have lists like a syllabus almost to tell you. You don't need to make that up and you don't need to guess. And if you're not sure, because if you're not used to teaching these levels, it's a good idea to just check them out and have an idea of how these how the language progresses from one level to another. And another way, of course, and this is something that we all do, whether we are writing professionally or for our classes, is to actually look at a good course book published by a reputable publisher. Okay, so if there is a course book that you like or you know of and you can access that course book, if you look at the syllabus, it will give you a good idea what language is being taught at which level. It doesn't change very much, okay? The same things are being taught all around the world at the same levels. These things, small things might change from year to year, but very, very little changes. Okay, so I would always say that's my first port of call very often, is actually go into a course book and seeing what the syllabus looks like. So again, when we're talking about levels, what about how can we check the level of a text? When we use a course book and we give our students, our learners, a reading text from a course book, the publisher has already made sure that that level is just right for the students. But what about if we want to write a text ourselves? Or what if we find a text somewhere, a story, for example, and we think, oh, I'd like to show this or do this in class with our students. How can I check that the level is not too low or too high? We don't want it to be too easy, but we want to make it a bit challenging, but we don't want to frighten our students away. Thank you, Claire, for putting the Trinity handbook there too. So what we can do, we can use a language profiler. I discovered language profilers maybe a couple of years ago now, and it was a revolution for me. It was just incredible because I didn't know they existed. Okay, there are more than one language profilers available, but this is the one that I use. It isn't perfect, but it works for me, and it works quite well for young learners for primary materials. So this is called Vocab Kitchen. It's a website. It's free, okay? And basically, when you go to the website, you are presented with this page, and you can choose over here the vocabulary profilers. And usually, I profile a text according to the Common European Framework references, okay? The CEFR, A1, A2, etc. So how this works is you find a text, and I'm going to show you an example of a text that I found. So this is part of a text from the story Tom Sawyer, and I took it from the Gutenberg project, and I'm going to write that here that you can look it up as well. The Gutenberg project is an online library with free copyright, if you like. So everything in there you can use to create readings, etc. So I went to that site and I found the story of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, and then I wanted to check the level, if you like. So I cut and pasted into this tool, this software, which is free. And as you can see, it comes up color coded, and each of those colors represents a level. Okay, so it's really wonderful. Thanks, Joan, for putting the link. So for example, here, most of the words will be A1. That's always the case, no matter how high a level a text is, because of words like the and etc. And here we can see we've got a couple of B2s. There are no C1s. So if I was using this text in a class and my class was a B1 level, I'd probably leave those 4 words in, and I would decide whether they would need a little bit of support to understand them, or maybe there would be a cognate there that they would get anyway, or I might provide a glossary or whatever. Or if I might decide to change one of those words and bring the level down. Okay, so that's what a language profiler does. And as I say, there are others available. If you go to Google and you write language profiler, you can get a few other options, but this works quite well for primary. So it's very useful, a very useful tool. Another area where we make mistakes, and I think this is one of the biggest areas, I think, thinking about myself and my own development as a writer. When I think back to when I used to make materials for my classes, I'm quite sure that the actual content that I was creating was quite good and quite nice. But I'm pretty sure if I looked back through them again, that some of my written instructions would have been quite poor. Because when we give an instruction in class and we're speaking, we can repeat things, we can demonstrate, we can say things another way. But when we're writing, when we're making some written materials, we can't change what we've written, and we don't usually spend a long time on the instructions. And as Ezra says there, giving a complete instruction is an art. So that's absolutely true. And these are the three main problems that I've come across, and other writers mention, other teachers in materials. So the first one is that the level of the rubric, the instruction, is higher than the level of the materials. This happens a lot, and it happens a lot with primary materials. So we might have a class of very young learners with an A1 level or an A2 level, but we might sneak in some language in the rubric, like a present perfect or something, that's above their level. And that's something that we need to be aware of. I think the first step is actually being aware of it and thinking about it. So another problem is having a complicated string of instructions in one rubric. So what we need to do, we need to make sure that if we're asking our students to do more than one thing, we break those instructions down. Okay, and very often again, we have inconsistency in our rubrics. So we might be asking them to do two different exercises, but we might have two different rubrics for the same activity, if you like. So for example, I've got an example here, how to make instructions sort of age appropriate, if you like. So here we've got 4 rubrics, 4 instructions for exactly the same activity. And they go from a higher level, if you like, down to very, very simple. So at the very, very basic sort of level, for very young learners, we can actually forget about words altogether, and we can just use icons. We can invent our icons, so we can look at what's used in books and copy them, okay? But the most important thing is to think a little bit about the instructions that we give. So I'm going to ask you to do something now. Okay, I'm going to show you an activity. First of all, look carefully at the activity and think for a moment, please, before you start writing, about what it is that I want you to do, that I want the students to do, okay? And then I want you to write in the chat box what the instructions should be. This is taken from a primary 5 book where students are about 9 years old, 9 or 10 years old. So what would the instruction be? We all know what they have to do, but how would you put that into words? So think about it. And okay, so Mandy says use the words to complete the sentences. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes or a minute or two to see what you say, because there are always several ways of giving that instruction. Okay. The same activity can have 10 different possible rubrics, and some will be better than others. And I think as a general rule, we should always think that the simpler, the better. Okay. Okay, so Claire has said in the correct verb form. Okay, so she's given more instructions there. Use the words in the box in the correct verb form to complete the sentences. Okay, so Margarita. Hi, Margarita. I didn't see you that you were here. Good to see you. So she's extended it. And choose the right word to fill in the blanks. So the more you think about this, what you have to think about is write a rubric, write an instruction, and then think, does it have all of the information they need So we're going to fill the blanks, as Abdul Samad has said, with the words, but do we need anything else? And as Margarita has said, we need to put them into the correct form. I'm going to give you another one, okay? So here's another one. Look very carefully at this again. Look carefully and then think about what the, it's from the same book, the same level, okay? So they're about 9 years old, primary. And think what they have to do here. And just write your ideas in the box. So don't be afraid of making a mistake or anything, and you'll all have different ideas and different opinions, so please don't worry at all about that. So Claire has written, complete the dialogue using the nouns in the box. Very specific there, she said nouns. So, and she's recognized that it's a dialogue. Complete this, yeah, okay. Yeah, she's a academic English. So obviously with primary, we probably wouldn't say nouns. We'd probably just say words because they don't need to know that they're nouns, do they? And in this particular activity, they've just learnt these words. The point is that they're revising them. Okay. Oh, Stephen Harker's getting very, he's getting all creative on us and he's adding a bit of oral practice. Ezra, thank you. You are the first person to notice. You are the first person to notice that there are 2 extra words. So if there are 2 extra words, we need to put that information in the instruction, in the rubric, because if we don't, we will confuse the learners, okay? And this is a typical exam style question from a young learner exam, okay? And I think it says something like, complete the dialogue using the words in the box. There are 2 extra words, okay? Something like this. And you're all along, you're all thinking along the right lines. And the important thing is to think about this. I think a very good activity actually for our own professional development, if you like, would be to actually go through a primary course book and cover the instructions and just look at the activity and think, how would I word that instruction? And then have a look to see what the instruction is. And maybe your version will be better, okay? Or maybe you'll realize when you look at the instruction that you've forgotten something that should have been added. Also, as you see in these 2 examples, we've got examples here, okay? So one of them has already been done. And I think that given an example is always a good rule of thumb, especially for primary learners, because they're still learning how to learn, aren't they? They're young, they're children, they're still in the process of learning everything. It's not just the language. So given an example is always, for me, it's the best way to give a written example, and then maybe model examples as well. So that's great. Well done. So I would say when it comes to rubrics, always double check what you've written, because it's very easy to get them wrong. And the simpler the better. Break down a long instruction. And number 4 is the mum test. So I don't know if you can guess what that is. And it's something that I sort of imagine when I write something. And I imagine if I showed this to my mum, and my mum is not very particularly educated woman, and she's never learned a language, and it's a long, long time since she was at school. So if I showed this activity to my mum with this instruction, would she understand what she needed to do? And obviously I don't really show my mum these things, but I imagine it, and then I think, no, she'd be lost. And if I think she'd be lost, then it fails the mum test, and we should go back to the drawing board and come up with another idea. And the last idea here is to build up a bank of rubrics. sometimes when we work for publishers, they provide us with a bank of rubrics and they tell us to use the same ones again and again so that the materials are consistent. But there's nothing to stop us from doing the same thing. And if we build up a bank of rubrics and then just cut and paste them, it serves two purposes. First of all, it stops us having to think about the rubric because we'll already have one. And if we don't have one for that particular activity, then we make a new one and add it to the bank. But another thing it's useful for is that afterwards, when you're writing materials, it can serve as as a list of all the different types of activities that you can do. So if you're feeling a little bit brain dead, and that happens to all of us sometimes, and we think, oh, I'll do another gap fill or whatever, we'll think, oh, hang on a minute, let me just look at my list of rubrics. And you might remind yourself of another activity that might be a little bit more interesting, or at least a change. Another thing is copyright. Now, copyright is a very big area, and I'm not going to go into length on copyright. I think copyright would be an excellent topic for another webinar. And I would not be the right person to do that webinar, but I think that YLTSIG might be think maybe about somebody who would be good on this. But what I've noticed when it comes to copyright and looking at the materials that teachers take into their classroom, the biggest problem is images, okay, pictures. Because what we do, and I put myself up here as an example because I've done it myself many times. I think to myself, I need a picture for these materials. So I go to Google and I write in Google what I want a picture of, and I find the perfect picture, and then I cut and paste it into my materials without giving a single thought to whether or not what I'm doing is legal. I used to do that, okay? I don't do that anymore. So I have two tips here, just two tips. So the first one is basically my firm belief is that everybody knows someone who can draw. So I'm just going to ask you to think for a moment, okay, and to write in the chat box the name of a person, your mum, your sister, a student, somebody you know who can draw. Because we always say, or we often say, oh, I can't draw, I'm rubbish at drawing. So, okay, so Elizabeth says her husband, Abdul Samad, one of his students. Okay, with me, it's my daughter. With Jen, who's here somewhere, I know it's her daughter because she's a very good drawer. Hajar says his sister. Okay, so when you think about it, we all have somebody around us who is good at drawing, and usually, if somebody is good at drawing, they enjoy drawing. And I know that no matter how busy my daughter is, because she enjoys drawing, if I ask her if she can draw me a picture of this or that, she'll be happy to do it because she enjoys drawing. And then you don't have to worry anything about copyright, okay? And your students as well can draw, okay? Your own students can draw. So that's one idea. Just ask somebody to draw you some pictures. And the other one is just a tip about doing a Google search, okay? So most of us use Google when we search for images. Not always, and some of us know about other sites where we can find copyright-free materials, images, etc. But if you go to Google, at the very bottom, if you do an advanced search, so if you go into Google and you do a search, you write, for example, I put here cat, okay? And you do a search. If you click on advanced image search, at the very bottom, at the last thing in that list, it says usage rights. And if you click on that, you'll get these options. Okay? So you can choose to have an image, to find an image which is free to use, to share, or modify or whatever. And if you use that as your default setting when you do an image search, then you won't need to worry that you're breaking copyrights. So I clicked on free to use, share or modify, even commercially, for my cat picture. And I got lots of pictures of cats and lots more, okay? So what I'm saying is there are hundreds and hundreds of pictures that are there that you can use without worrying too much about the copyright. But you should think about copyright, okay? And I can't express this too strongly. It's an issue that we need to bear in mind when we create materials. Okay, but again, as I said, that'll be a webinar hopefully for another day. Okay, moving on swiftly. Answer keys. One of the in that survey that I did, one of the problems was that answer keys don't always match the answers. Well, we don't always write answer keys, especially when we write materials for our own classes, but I would suggest here that we always write an answer key, because sometimes we might want to use the materials again and we've forgotten, we can't be expected to remember everything. Also, if you write an answer key at the same time as you write your materials, that is the moment when you find out that certain exercises don't actually work. Or maybe there's more than one correct answer for a question, etc. That's when you find errors in your materials. I promise you, I've done that time and time again. And it's also a good idea to keep an answer key in a separate document. Maybe you can keep it in the same document as well, but it's good to have it separately because sometimes we change a document and we lose the answer key. I'm just speaking from experience here, okay? So that's just a short message there about answer keys. Very briefly here, swiftly moving on to one of the problems was messy or overcrowded pages. And the question here is why is layout and page design important? Okay, well, firstly, I think sometimes we have overcrowded pages because we want to fit as much as possible onto one worksheet because we want to save paper and we don't want to print out 2 pages, we want to print out 1 or something like this. So there's a tendency to try to fit too much in. But it's very important to think about layout and page design for this reason, okay? Accessibility. At the top here, accessibility, SEN is special educational needs and inclusion. This is for me, it's all one thing, okay? So I read a report very recently. The UK school census came out in July 2017, and it told us the percentage of students, of pupils in England with special educational needs. So I'm just going to ask you to guess what that percentage is, and then I'll tell you what the figure is, okay? So these are children who have recognized special educational needs and need extra help. So some of you put in very high figures there. It's interesting that you put in these figures. So I'm going to tell you in a sec. I'll give you a chance. I'll give you an opportunity it's lower than some of the ones you've got there. Okay. This was England. Okay, so a developed country. Obviously, different parts of England have higher and lower rates, but in general, this was England. Okay, so it was 14.4%. And then here are some other figures, okay? So there are more boys than girls. And this SEN statement that they're talking about, that means that they've actually got a document which recognises that they've got special educational needs. And then when you look at the kind of problems or difficulties, I should say, that they range from more serious disabilities to less easy to pick up issues, okay? So children who are hard of hearing, children with dyslexia, sight problems, behavioral problems that affect their learning, etc. Thank you, Ella, for saying special educational needs. So when it comes to worksheets, we can address some of these needs, okay? Especially in terms of people with dyslexia, people with spatial problems. And this is a guideline, okay? And I've taken some do's and don'ts, and I've just put them here in a list for you. Some of them are common sense. Apparently, the colours I've used here, I know this is a slide and not a worksheet, but they are the optimum colours apparently, like a pale yellow and a dark grey font, so that the contrast is not as great as black on white. Okay, I'm not going to read everything out there because you can see that for yourself. And I've put at the bottom there, put yourself in the shoes of all the potential users. Sometimes there's a tendency, I think, to use different colour fonts, different sizes, different styles, and different things on different parts of the page. And that can actually physically cause headaches for some children. So we need to rethink things a little bit, step back and make everything a bit simpler. I put at the bottom there, if you Google or YouTube how to write an accessible Word document, you'll get lots of information about this because most universities these days have guidelines and government offices and this kind of thing. They'll be repeated. The same things come up obviously again and again. But if you've got anybody in your class with any kind of learning sort of aspects that they need help with, if you like, need support and special needs, it's a good idea to kind of read up on this a little bit. And even if you think you haven't, chances are that you have, because obviously not everything is picked up on. So it's a good idea to maybe think about this in a preventative way rather than, after the problems start, pick up on them beforehand. So appropriate content. Moving on. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to go a little bit quicker. Are my materials appropriate? Okay, what do we mean by that? Well, for young learners, I think we mean a few things. So, are they age appropriate? So when we talk about primary, for example, somebody in the first year and second year of primary is very different to somebody in the final years of primary. And we need to keep this in mind. One size does not suit all. Are our materials culturally relevant? Are we teaching them about the cultural references that are appropriate for them to be learning? Do they need to know this? Is it helpful? Would it be more useful to teach them something else? What resources are available? So are we asking them to do things and then finding out later that they might not have the resources to do what we're asking? And again, we should think about the level of not only their language, but their digital literacy, the level of challenge as well. Are our materials challenging enough? The beauty of making our own materials for our classes, of course, is that we can differentiate, can't we? We can make worksheets where we have different tasks for different levels. And address these things, but it's things to be considered when we make our materials. So I'm going to offer us a simple, I've called it a framework, or it can be a checklist if you like, for when we make materials for our students. And again, I think this is basically common sense, but kind of summing up what we've just seen in the rest of the webinar. So always ask somebody to proofread your materials, okay? Just anybody, your son, your daughter, a student, a colleague. It doesn't have to be a professional ELT person, okay? As long as they can understand English. Check your materials are legal. So there I'm talking about copyright. Check your layout is clear. Things like numbering comes into this. I mean, does it follow a logical order? Is it easy? Have you got if you've got two columns, do you go 1, 2, 3 down a column and then 4, 5, or do you go across the page? If you're not sure how you should have the layout, look at books and materials that you've used and you like and copy their layout. Okay, there's no rule on copyright for layout. Check your instructions are easy to understand. So do the mum test. Check that every learner can access your materials. So I mean physically, but also in terms of their abilities, their cognitive abilities, etc. And if one learner needs support, we'll give them that support. Because if there is one learner in your class who cannot, for some reason, access the materials, then you failed. And that sounds harsh, but it's something I believe. Check your materials are appropriate for the group, but also for each individual learner. So when you're thinking about talking about a certain topic, just check and think about these individual students and don't just see them as a group. And I think it's a good idea to build in a reflection stage when you create materials because very often we use the materials in class, they go well or they don't go well, we might use them again, whatever, but usually because we're so busy, that's kind of the end of it. But I think as a professional development activity, if you like, or strategy, it's a really good idea to sit down after you've used them and just spend 5 minutes making some notes about how they worked. Did they work well? Were the students engaged? Did they enjoy them? Were there any problems? Would you change anything next time? And immediately after is always best. I know it's not always practical, but I think it's a good thing to do. I know that we don't always do these things, but I'm saying say as I do and say as I say and not as I do or whatever the saying is. But it's a good thing to do, I think. And above all, and I think this is actually the most important thing of all, enjoy creating your materials because it really is one of the most rewarding parts, I think, of being a teacher. You have an opportunity to be creative. You have an opportunity to give your students something precious, some tailor-made materials that are for them and for them only. You can address their needs. You can give them things that really motivate them. You can touch on topics that they ask for. They can even get involved in, you could say we're going to do some reading next week. What would you like to read about? And get some feedback from them. So that's the most important thing for me. And that's my email for you to send any questions or anything you want to ask me or tell me, please write to me. And we've got 3 or 4 minutes for any questions. So please, if anybody's got any questions, you can write them in the chat box. If Joan picks up any questions, fire away. If I can't answer them, I'm sure somebody else in the group out of the 37 participants will be able to answer them. Margit says she loves creating materials even more than teaching. Well, I think I mean, by the law of averages, a percentage of all teachers become professional materials writers. That's what happened to me. And if it's something that you love doing, and I know that some people in this group are going down that road and starting out on the adventure of being professional writers, and it's a very exciting thing. It's a lovely thing to do. So, and good luck to everybody. And if I can help or offer any advice, please don't be afraid to get in touch. Alex is asking, do you have an illustrator when you write for a publisher? Yes, you do. And the illustrators are magicians. They work their magic and they make they make your wonderful material fantastic, and they take it to a whole different level, because illustrators really are mind-blowing sometimes what they can do. Um, can you say more about layout, how it should be different for young learners? Um, I think it depends. I think layout should be attractive. I think it's good to have images on the page. So pictures usually should support the learning. You shouldn't just have an illustration for the sake of it because it looks pretty. It should be there to support the learning in some way. And I think the layout should be very logical. So sequencing is needs to be clear. Headings are important too. It's important to have headings so that children know when something is beginning and when it ends, maybe a line across the bottom, that kind of thing. Claire is asking, do you think writers can continue to produce excellent materials even if they've been out of teaching for a while? That's a really good question. I think they can, but I don't think it's because I think the important thing is that even if they haven't been teaching for a while, they are still connecting with other teachers. That's why I think it's very important that we connect, we collaborate, we join in groups with other teachers online, on Facebook, in any context really. I think it's a really good thing to meet with other people. That's why it's a good idea to join SIG groups and like the young learners and teen SIG, like the more SIG. And if you connect with other people, then even though you're not in the classroom yourself, sometimes you are getting information from other people. And these days on the internet, you can actually watch classroom practice. You can see videos of things going on. You can, there are ways of doing things. So it's exactly what Claire says there. Out of classroom is not bad per se, but out of touch would be. Exactly. And I think I'll end on that note and then just hand over. I've got one message to read out, but so stay in touch with other people, with me, with us, with other people in the group. Don't be on your own, okay? Just connect at every opportunity. So, if anybody's got any more questions, please send them through to me or to us, and we'll answer them. And I just want to make one short announcement as well. We've got one up on the notice there that Joan's put up, and also that for members, followers, and friends in or near Greece, IATEFL Young Learners and Teens SIG is supporting the upcoming TESOL Greece Young Learners Colloquium in Athens on the 21st to the 22nd of October. And I'll be giving the opening plenary there, focusing again on quality in primary materials. And Joe Budden from the British Council Teens site will be giving the closing plenary on authentic video materials with teenagers. So we look forward to meeting as many of you as possible there. And please check out the TESOL Greece website for
Great.
registration
Thank you
information.
so much.
So that's it from me, and I'm going to hand you back over to
Joan. Like this was an extremely useful webinar, so we really appreciate all the work you put into preparing that for us, Catherine. Thank you so much, Kat. And some of you were asking, and I just wanted to point out one more time that there will be a recording available on the IATEFL website, and that is for members, and you can keep in touch through the YLT Facebook group for sure, and I'm sure the MOSIG group as well. And I'll just put that link in the chat box for you so that you can join. Give me 1 second. All right, so there you can keep in touch through Facebook, and we'll post when the webinar recording is ready. So we hope you all really enjoyed Catherine's great webinar and have lots of ideas and principles to take away for creating your own primary materials. And if you are interested in learning more about materials writing, please join the IATEFL online conference in November. And the YLTSIG will be holding a panel discussion with authors and publishers about ways into materials writing. And there will be more information about this IATEFL online conference on the IATEFL website. So I have the website there at the bottom of this slide. We'd also like to share a couple of dates for your schedule about upcoming events. And we have 2 webinars in our series that are coming up in October and November. So the October YLTSIG webinar is in collaboration with the IATEFL Research SIG, and it will be by Dr. Anna Maria Pinter. And that will take place October 28th at 3 p.m. GMT. And then our November webinar, also jointly hosted with the Research SIG, is with Sandy Morale. And that is going to take place November 26th at 3 p.m. GMT. So please visit the IATEFL website for more information. Thank you all very much for attending today. And thanks from all of us at the YLTSIG and the YLTSIG. And we hope to see you at the next IATEFL event or webinar. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.